Hello, this is the Math Success Workshop Part 2, where we talk about taking notes in a math class and what to do with your notes. All right, so starting off with a question for you. Are your notes organized? All right, and maybe how could you better organize your notes? If the answer to that first question is no, not really, like how could you better organize your notes? So maybe pause the video here and think about that. Try to come up with some ideas of your own of like how can I make my notes a little bit more organized. Um, One thing that I've seen with students that I've taught or that I've like tutored before, they pull out their notebook to ask for help with their math stuff, and they're looking for something in their notebook, like, oh, we did an example like this somewhere in class the other day, and they're flipping through their notebook, and one page is notes from history class, and the next page is notes from a chemistry class, and then the page after that is notes from a math class, and it's just all kind of mixed together, and is like not really organized at all, and it's like impossible for that person to find what they're looking for. So if that describes you, then some of the things we'll talk about in this video, might help you out as far as keeping your notes more organized, and then, using them in order to help you do better in class. All right. So first thing, organizing your notes. Right. How to take notes effectively. Organization. All right. So first thing, like what I just mentioned there, try to have a separate notebook for each class. Right. A notebook for your math class, a notebook for your chemistry class, a notebook for your history class, or whatever it is. And if you just don't have enough notebooks, or you can't afford to go buy all those different notebooks, at least try to have separate sections in your notebook for each class. So like I'm going to put all my math notes at the beginning of this notebook, and then I'll flip to the middle, and that's where I'm going to put my history notes, and then at the end is where I'm going to put the chemistry notes. Try to keep them separated so that when you're looking for something, you at least know where to go to try to find it without having all that information like mixed together with no type of organization to it at all. All right, so a separate notebook for each class is an important thing. Having an actual notebook, not just taking notes on loose leaf paper and then throwing the loose leaf paper into your bag at the end of class, along with other loose leaf papers from your notes from other classes. Having all that stuff together in a notebook or a binder is really important. When you're taking notes, real good idea. Put a date on the top of the notes. Today's date, the date that you're taking those notes, of course, not some other date. So put the date at the top of the notes, and then also write the section or the topic heading for what you're doing in class that day. Most teachers will tell you, today we're doing section 5.2, which is all about how to factor polynomials or whatever, just to pull a random, topic from a math class. Right? So write that at the top of your notes. Then when you go back for your notes later, you can say, well, I know we talked about this, last Tuesday in class. So if you have it by date, you can go to Tuesday's date, and then you know that the information is going to be there. Or if you know it's something that relates to, what did I just say, factoring polynomials? Well, then you have that topic at the top of the page. You just flip through your notes until you see that topic, factoring polynomials, and then you know that the notes or the examples you're looking for are going to be there in your notebook, right? You know where to find the stuff that you need, right? So that's a real helpful thing for organization, dating the notes, writing the section number or the topic or both at the top of the page or at the beginning of that day's notes. Really important to do, can help you out a lot. Write your notes neatly, right? That's sometimes easier said than done, especially if your teacher talks really fast or writes things on the board really fast and then erases them immediately. You have to write things down quickly sometimes, but try to make it as neat as possible. If you go back later and look at your notes and you can't read what you wrote, your notes are basically useless at that point, right? You need to be able to read the things that you wrote down. You can also, something to help you keep it neat is to organize it with bullets or with an outline. That doesn't always work so well with a math class. It might work a little bit better with some other classes. But still, keeping some type of organization. I'm going to put definitions here, and then I'm going to indent a little bit when we do examples or things like that, just so some pattern to your notes, so you know what you're looking at when you look back at your notes. You can use different colors. Right, you can use maybe a pencil to write down definitions, and then I'm going to use a blue pen to write formulas. I'm going to use a black pen to write down the example problems. Color coding it like that. Once again, when you go back later and you're looking for an example, well, I wrote all my examples in black pen, so I just need to go through my notes and look for the stuff written in black pen, and then that's going to help me find the example that I need quicker. Right, so that's one thing you can do that could be helpful. Underlining or highlighting important content. Also good, I've seen students in the past, they take notes with a pencil, but also with a highlighter sitting next to them. So when the teacher says, oh, this is important, or you need to memorize this formula, you can highlight that formula, or, underline it, or draw like a big star next to it in your notes. Do something to highlight or make a mark for that stuff that is going to be very important. And a lot of times your teachers will tell you those things that are important, right? So don't just say, okay, he said this is important, whatever, and then it looks like everything else in your notes. Mark that off in some way. Even like I said, even if it's just like drawing a big star next to it or something like that, or like a big arrow pointing at it, so that you can find it later and know that this is an important thing that I need to make sure that I know, before I sit down and take a quiz or a test or something like that. All right, so these are, just some things you could do to help you take notes more effectively, to better organize your notes. I'm not saying you have to do all of these things. Doing every single one of these things might be a little bit of overkill, especially if you don't do any of these things right now. But if you don't do any of these things right now, pick one or two. Right? Try to start dating your notes or writing the section on the top. Maybe try to use different colors or use a highlighter. And see how that feels, and if it's going good, maybe come back to this list and try a couple more of these things. Right? The better organized your notes are, the more useful they're going to be to you for studying, for doing homework, for just reviewing things that happened in class. Organization is a key here. All right, next thing, what do you write down in your notes? Right? And is there a more efficient way to take notes? Right? Are your notes incomplete? Do you write down the stuff the teacher says at the beginning of class, and then halfway through you get bored or you get confused by what they're saying, and then you just kind of stop writing? Do you start writing down one of the examples your teacher does, but then you have to go to the bathroom, so you get up and walk out, and then you don't have the end of that example, or you don't know what the answer of it's going to be? Do you try to write down every single word that your teacher says? Right? Because that might be doing too much if you're doing stuff like that. All right, so let's talk about what you should be writing down in your notes, or how to take notes, like what you can write down. So one thing before we get to what you're actually writing down in class, a good idea for taking notes is to read the section in the textbook before class. Right? Just to give you a preview of the material. It doesn't mean like you completely understand it before class starts, or you even have any idea what it's talking about. But if you just kind of read through that section before class starts, whether it's the night before or if you get to class a little bit early and you read through it, just to give you an idea, it kind of like primes your mind to accept the new information, and it also gives you an idea of what's important, right? Well, there's these couple definitions here. There's this big formula that looks like it's important. There's a couple example problems. And then when your teacher's going through that stuff, you're like, oh yeah, this is that formula I saw. I know this is going to be important, so I kind of know that I have to write this down in my notes, right? So getting that little preview of what you're doing by reading ahead of time is helpful in kind of having an idea of what you need to write down. Pretty much anything your teacher puts on the board, you should probably write down. If your teacher puts an example problem on the board, or if they write definitions or formulas on the board, probably you should write those things down. Right? You should also write down teachers' explanations of what they're putting on the board. Right? If a teacher writes a formula on the board, that formula in and of itself is not always the whole story. And the teacher might not write everything else that they're saying, but they might say, okay, here's this quadratic formula. Again, just to pick a random example from a math class, here's a quadratic formula that you need to memorize. All right, we use this formula when we're trying to solve a quadratic equation and we can't factor it. So that's what this formula is used for. Now, they're probably not going to write all that on the board. They're probably just going to put the formula on the board, and then you should be writing in your notes, use this to solve a quadratic equation when you cannot factor. Those things should be going into your notes as well. Right? So you shouldn't only write what the teacher puts on the board. Right? The teacher probably doesn't have enough time to write every single thing that's important on the board for every class. Right? Sometimes they just say things out loud that it's up to you to hear that and understand it's important and write it down. So things like I just mentioned, like if they tell you when to use a certain formula, you should make a note of that in your notes. Right? Or if they tell you, this definition is one that you definitely need to know, or this relates to this other topic we talked about, make a note of that. This relates back to this thing that we did last week, and then you can kind of see how it ties in, right? So things like that you should also be putting in your notes, your teacher's explanations of what they're writing on the board. Write down the example problems the teacher does. Most math teachers will do example problems in class, And don't just write down the problem and then wait till the teacher gets to the answer and write down the answer. You should be writing down every step of the problem along the way. And while your teacher is going through those steps, if he or she is explaining what's going on, like, oh, we do this here because, I have to divide both sides by 3 because I need to get the x by itself. Right? If you don't understand that already, like when you see the teacher do that, you should make a note of that, maybe next to that step in your notes. When you divide by 3, write, put an arrow next to it and say, oh, because we need to get x by itself, right? So write down those examples, write down every step, and also those little explanations like I talked about a minute ago. If those will be helpful, write those down as well. Try to work out the examples along with the teacher. This is if you're feeling fairly comfortable with the material. Right? If your teacher's going through an example and like explaining what's going on, but you think you can maybe do it yourself already, try to do it yourself as the teacher's doing it and talking about it. And if you can work through the problem, a little bit ahead of the teacher or kind of at the same time that the teacher is, and you end up doing the same thing and getting the right answer, well, then you know that you feel pretty good with this material, and it gives you that little boost of confidence. And it also tells you that that's maybe something that you don't have to spend a lot of time reviewing later because you were already able to do it on your own. Think, right? Don't just sit there and write down everything that's on the board and try to write down every word that comes out of the teacher's mouth, but think about those things as you're writing them down. Right? Like I said, as you're going through an example problem, when your teacher divides both sides of the equation by 3, think to yourself, well, why are we dividing by 3 here? And if you can figure out why it is, it just helps make more sense of the things that are going on in class. Right? Just kind of blindly writing things down without a thought about it isn't the most effective way to take notes. Right? Ask questions sometimes, slow things down. Some teachers, like I mentioned before, talk really fast, write things down on the board really fast, and then erase them immediately. If your teacher's going too fast, even if you don't really have a question, even if you kind of understand what's going on, you can raise your hand and say, oh, can you explain that last step again? Just to make your teacher slow down so that you have a chance to catch up with writing down the things that they've said or the things that they've put on the board, right? So, and if your teacher's going too fast for you to write things down, chances are that there's more people in the room that feel the same way. So if you raise your hand and ask a question just to slow things down a little bit, some of your fellow students will probably be thanking you for that because they're in the same boat as you are. All right, so don't be afraid to ask questions, even if it's just to make the teacher be quiet for a minute so you can write things down. Right, highlight difficult topics. If your teacher goes through example, you don't understand it, you ask a question about it, they explain it again, you still don't get it, highlight that. Mark it with your highlighter or put a star next to it as something that you need to come back to later and review. Right. Again, the notes aren't just for writing down in class and you never see them again. Right. You need to be reviewing them later so that you learn something from them. Right. So highlight things that you don't understand to come back to later. Also, listen for little clues that your teacher gives. If your teacher does an example and then steps back and says, "Oh, I really like this problem," you can be pretty sure that that problem is going to be on a quiz or a test coming up soon, right? So listen for those little cues, those little clues that your teacher gives about what they like, what they don't like, what's important, and make notes of those as well. All right, and then what do you do with your notes after class? How can you make your notes an effective tool for you to help you learn what's going on in class? All right, so reviewing your notes the same day is a real good idea. Sometime after class, read back through your notes again, kind of think about the examples you did in class, go through the steps again and make sure they make sense. If you marked things that didn't make sense, think about them again. For any confusing topics, clarify with your teacher, email your teacher and ask, or ask a classmate, or go to a tutor and try to get help from a tutor for those confusing topics. And don't wait, right? Do that the same day that you were in class because, like I said previously, math material tends to build on itself. So if you let it go for a couple weeks and there's something you don't understand, before too long, you're not going to understand anything going on in class because you didn't pick up on that, that previous topic, right? So that's why you should be reviewing your notes the same day and getting help with things that didn't make sense right away. If you miss class, copy your notes from a classmate, check with the professor to make sure there's not anything else important that you missed. Follow along with the notes, especially the example problems when you do homework. A lot of homework problems are similar to example problems that teachers do in class, right? So that's one reason why you should be writing down the example problems and writing down every step so that when you get stuck on a homework problem, you can go back and look at the examples and kind of use those as a guide to help you through the homework. And then the last thing on here is reviewing notes to prepare for quizzes and tests. Right, so those are things you should be doing with your notes, reviewing them, clarifying topics that were confusing, and then you also use them for homework and for studying. All right, and in our next video, we'll talk about how to use the math textbook effectively, and then in other videos, we'll also talk about doing homework and studying for tests like we just mentioned here. So check out those other videos.